Welcome to the Steps in Purpose podcast with Edie Ann. This podcast explores emotional awareness, faith, and purposeful living through short, reflective conversations designed to help you notice where you are and take your next step with clarity. Thanks for being here. Have you ever noticed how often we say the words, I am tired, I'm overwhelmed, I'm stuck, I'm behind, I'm a mess, I'm afraid, right? Sometimes we say those words without even realizing how deeply they're landing inside of us. They come out in conversation, frustration, when we're exhausted, and sometimes even in quiet moments when we're trying to just make sense of what we're feeling, right? So I want to talk about the power of those two words, because I am is more than just a phrase. It's actually a declaration. It's something we speak over ourselves. And when we say it over and over again, our heart begins to listen. And our brain starts to attach those things as identity, right? There's something sacred about the words I am. If you know the Bible, Moses asked God who he should say sent him, right? And God replies, I am who I am. That moment is pretty powerful because God's revealing himself as present, eternal, complete, enough, right? He didn't introduce himself by any type of limitation of fear or a circumstance. He said, I am. And because we're created by God, made in his image, our words carry weight too, right? Our I am statements may never compare to God's holy name, obviously, but they do reveal what we are agreeing with in our hearts, in our own hearts. So when I say, I am a mess, I'm attaching mess to my identity. When I say I am stuck, I'm attaching stuck to my identity. When I say I'm afraid, I'm attaching fear to my identity. Does that make sense? I am whatever I say after. And you know what? I say this with so much love because I've done it too, and I still do it. I've attached things to myself that God would never call me. I've spoken from fear, from pain, disappointment, and really old stories. I've repeated words because they felt familiar, even though they were never the truth of who God created me to be. Right? That is where self-love comes in. Self-love is learning to see ourselves through the eyes of God. It's learning to speak to ourselves with the same grace and compassion we would offer someone we care about. It's learning to treat the tender places inside of us with care instead of criticism. I often think about it like this. How would I speak to a 7-year-old child? I have granddaughters that are 7. If a 7-year-old child came to me with tears in her eyes and said, I am a failure, I would speak to her with compassion and care and love. I would soften my voice like I just did. I would remind her that one hard moment doesn't define who she is. I'd tell her she's learning. I would tell her she's growing, and I would remind her that she's precious, loved, and safe. Right? I'd never look at her and say, yep, you're a failure. I would never pile more shame on top of her little heart. I would reach for the truth of who she is and help her see it again. So why do we speak to ourselves in ways we would never speak to a child? that we love? That question has sat with me because sometimes the way we talk to ourselves reveals those places where we still are learning how to receive God's love, right? The Bible tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think many of us learned the neighbor part while rushing past the ourselves part. We pour out love. We encourage others. We speak life into people. We remind them of their worth. Then we turn inward and speak with harshness and judgment and disappointment. But God's love includes us too. You are allowed to speak kindly to yourself. You know that, right? You're allowed to get grace. You're allowed to see yourself as loved, forgiven, guided, and created with purpose. You're allowed to say, I am healing. Even while the process is still unfolding. You're allowed to say, I am growing. Even while you're still figuring things out. You're allowed to say, I am held. Even while life feels heavy. And you're allowed to say, I am loved. Because God already said it first. I want to share that this connects really beautifully with the emotion gauge because every place on the gauge has its own language. When we're disengaged, our words may sound quiet and distant. When we're in survival, our words can sound exhausted and pressured. When we're in victim, our words they can sound powerless. And when we're in frustrated, our words may sound sharp and tired. Those words help us recognize where we are. And that awareness is a gift, not our identity, right? And the emotion gauge helps us see where we are emotionally, while God's truth reminds us who we are spiritually. Where we are can change. Who God says we are remains steady. So instead of using I am to name the struggle, we can use it to remind us of the truth. We can say, I feel tired and I'm still held. We can say, I feel overwhelmed and I am still guided. We can say, I feel uncertain and I am still learning to trust. We can say, I feel disappointed and I am still growing. We can say, I feel tender and I am still loved. You see the difference? Feels different, right? It gives space for honesty and truth to kind of sit together. We can acknowledge what we feel while still speaking life over who we are. That's self-love. That is renewing the mind. We're learning to align our words with how God sees us. We're learning to stop handing our identity over to feelings or a hard day or a painful time in our lives, right? God calls us His. He calls us loved, chosen, forgiven. He calls us created with purpose. And when God speaks identity over us, we can learn to agree with Him. Maybe this week, the shift begins in the smallest way. Maybe instead of saying, I am stuck, you say, I am taking one step. Maybe instead of saying, I am behind, you say, I am moving in perfect timing. Maybe instead of saying, I am too much, you say, I am created with depth and purpose. Maybe instead of saying, I am a mess, I say, I am human, loved, and learning. They may feel awkward at first. They always do. New language typically does. When we have spoken the old story for such a long time, that truth can feel unfamiliar before it feels natural, right? But the more we practice, speaking life into ourselves, the more our heart will start to recognize it. And you know what? There's such a tender form of healing in this. It's a way of coming back to yourself. It's a way of honoring the life God placed inside of you. It's a way of saying, Lord, help me see myself the way you see me. Because when we begin to understand the power of I am, we begin to pay attention to what we are planting. Words are seeds. The words we speak over ourselves can grow into fear, shame, and limitation. And they can grow into peace, courage, and truth, right? Depending on the words that we're using. So let's plant with care. Let's speak with love. Let's choose words that help our hearts remember. I am loved. I am forgiven. I am held. I am guided. I am healing. I am growing. I am learning. I am created with purpose. And I am still stepping in purpose. Thanks for being here today. Speak to yourself like someone God loves, because you are. Your next step matters. Thanks for spending this time with me. Until next time, keep stepping in purpose.